1. Hello, welcome to today's edition of Daf Yomi. Today's Daf is Shevuot Daf 16 Omeday. So let's dive straight in. Al Pi Novi Ne'acheles, Al Pi Novi Nifrefes. Based on a ruling of a prophet, the loaves of one thanks offering were eaten. So what does that mean? Rashi explains in 15 bit. That's the wrong footnote, sorry. When the procession reaches the end of the area they wish to consecrate, those present stand and partake of the loaves of one of the two thanks offerings, and the loaves of the other offering are burned. The prophet determines which loaves are eaten and which are burned, according to the opinion of Rabbi Yochanan. Rambam Sefer Voda Hilchot Beis Bechira 6:12 and the Radbaz and the Kesef Mishnah there. And based on a ruling of a prophet, the loaves of the other thanks offering were burned. The prophets Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who lived at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, reconstruction of Jerusalem, instructed the people concerning how the ceremony should be conducted without providing reason for the procedures. The Mishnah teaches, and with regard to any addition of the temple that was not made with all of these ceremonial procedures, one who enters there while richly impure is not liable. It was stated that the Moraim disagree about the text of the Mishnah. Rav Huna says, we learn in the Mishnah, with all these, which means that of all these procedures are indispensable, and even if one is missing, the consecration does not take effect. Rav Nachman says we learn in the Mishnah with all of these. But Achas Mikol Eilu, Rashi explained in 15b that this means that the presence of even one of all of the items listed in the Mishnah suffices for the consecration to be complete. The latter commentaries write that this relates only to the presence of a king, a prophet, the high priest, and Sanhedrin and Batum. All opinions require consecration by means of two thanks offerings or the remainder of a meal offering, and that's from the Chazon Ish. I.e., any one of these procedures suffices for the consecration to take effect. The Gemara further clarifies this agreement. Rav Huna says, we learn in the Mishnah with all these. The Gemara explains, he maintains that the initial consecration, what is that? Any place that was not consecrated with all the elements mentioned in the Mishnah and in that order is not completely consecrated. Although Ezra offered two thanks offerings, he did so merely as a commemoration of the initial consecration. He did not consecrate the area with his actions, as there was neither a king nor the Om Batumim. Nevertheless, the area was consecrated during the initial consecration in the time of Solomon, who consecrated the temple courtyard and the city of Jerusalem for the time and forever. Therefore, offerings may be sacrificed even when the temple is not standing. And offerings of the most sacred order can be eaten in the entire area of the temple courtyard, even when it is in a state of ruin and no longer enclosed by a wall. Offerings of lesser sanctity and the second highest produce can be eaten in the entire city of Jerusalem, even when it has no walls. In contrast to the initial consecration of Jerusalem and the temple, which was for all time, the initial consecration of Eretz Yisrael with regard to the sabbatical year, tithe, and other matters did not apply forever. This is because the sanctity of the temple and Jerusalem is due to the divine presence, which can never be nullified. But the halachot of the sabbatical year and tithe are based on the concept of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael by the Jewish people. When Eretz Yisrael was removed from the Jewish people, their conquest was negated, and the land was thereafter exempt by Torah law from the halachot relating to the sabbatical year and tithe. This is according to the opinion of Rav Nachman and the Gemara's conclusion that even Rabbi Eliezer maintained that the initial consecration of Jerusalem and the temple was for their time and forever. The Raiva disagrees and rules that not only was the initial consecration of Jerusalem and the temple nullified, but even the second consecration was nullified, as Ezra knew that the temple and Jerusalem would eventually be eternally consecrated. Therefore, he did not consecrate them forever. And that's in the Rambam Sefer Voda Hilchot Beis Bechira 6:14. And the temple in the days of David and Solomon sanctified it for its time and sanctified it forever. Therefore, the site of the temple retained its original sanctity even during the days of the second temple. And Ezra, who reconsecrated the area, did so merely as a commemoration of the initial consecration. Accordingly, even though there was no king or Batumim, the entire area was fully consecrated. By contrast, in order to consecrate an area that had not been part of the initial consecration, all of these procedures are necessary and none can be omitted. Rav Nachman says we learned in the Mishnah. With one of all these, the Gemara explains, he maintains that the initial consecration of the temple sanctified it for its time only, and did not sanctify it forever. And Ezra consecrated the temple and its courtyard, even though there was no king or Batumim. Consequently, it follows that there is no need for all of these procedures in order for the consecration to take effect. Rabbi raised an objection to Rav Nachman. The Mishnah explicitly states any addition that was not made with all these procedures. Rav Nachman said, amend the Mishnah and teach it as stating, with one of all of these procedures. The Gemara cites a proof against the opinion of Rav Nachman. Common here by to Abba Shaul says there were two ponds, Bizin. The Aramaic term, this Aramaic term is partly related to the biblical word bika and biza. The usual meaning of this word is swamp, or a place where water is gathered to form a shallow pond. On the Mount of Olives, Misha. Let's see it in the Hebrew. Hamishcha. The word mishcha means anointing in Hebrew and is similar to the Aramaic masha, meaning oil. This was therefore used as another name for Hatziim, the Mount of Olives. Allusion to this name are found in several places in the Bible where the mountain is referred to as the mountain that destroys, Ha-Hamashit, in Jeremiah 51:25, because of the idol worship that was conducted there. And there's a picture here, if you have the shine, show us on page 242, a view of the Mount of Olives from the old city of Jerusalem. A lower pond and an upper pond. The lower pond was consecrated during the time of the first temple, with all of the procedures mentioned in the Mishnah, and it had the sanctity of Jerusalem for all purposes. By contrast, the upper pond was not consecrated with all these procedures, rather it was consecrated by those who returned from the exile in Babylonia without a king and without the Urim Tumim. The Braita continued, with regard to the lower pond, whose consecration was complete, Amai Haaretz. What does that mean? According to the standard version of the Gemara, which is the version Rashi had, there was an obvious difficulty. Why did the Amei Haaretz refrain from eating second tithe in the areas that were added to the city, while at the same time they were allowed to partake of sacrificial food in the places where the Chaverim did not eat? Rashi explains at length that the Amei Haaretz who tithed their produce were extremely vigilant with regard to the mitzvah associated with it, because it required each person to make a declaration that he performed the mitzvah in a complete manner. Additionally, they were aware of the sage's statement that one who fulfills this mitzvah will be rewarded with wealth. Consequently, they were very careful to partake of the second tithe in a place whose sanctity was definite. Many early commentaries have different versions of the text, according to which the Chaverim and the Amei Haaretz partook of sacrificial food and second tithe in the area of the lower pond, and the only difference between these two groups was with regard to the upper pond, where the Amei Haaretz were stringent with regard to the second tithe and were lenient with regard to sacrificial food. Tosfos Harosh explained that Rashi preferred the standard version of the Gemara, which is essentially the version found in the Tosefta, over the other, more straightforward version, because if everyone was stringent in the lower pond, there would be no need to mention it at all, since it is like the rest of Jerusalem, and the novelty would be only with regard to the upper pond. Uneducated people who were not scrupulous in their observance of the mitzvot relating to tithe and to ritual purity would enter into there and would partake of offerings of lesser sanctity. Kadoshim Kalim, offerings of lesser sanctity. The offerings brought in the temple are divided into two main categories: offerings of the most sacred order and offerings of lesser sanctity. The offerings of the most sacred order include the Yom Kippur offerings, communal sin offerings, burnt offerings, and standard sin offerings. The offerings of lesser sanctity include peace offerings, animal tithe offerings, and the paschal offering. One of the primary differences between the two types of offerings is that the offerings of the most sacred order are slaughtered only in the northern section of the temple courtyard, while offerings of the lesser sanctity may be slaughtered anywhere in the courtyard. Another difference is that the prohibition against misusing temple property applies to offerings of the most sacred order as soon as they are consecrated, and it applies both to the portions that must be burned on the altar and to the portions that are to be eaten. For offerings of lesser sanctity, the prohibition applies only to those portions to be burned on the altar and only after the blood has been sprinkled on the altar. Furthermore, offerings of the most sacred order may be consumed only on the day that the animal is sacrificed and that night, while most offerings of lesser sanctity may also be consumed on the following day. That may be eaten in all of Jerusalem there, but they will not partake of second tithe. Maser Sheni, second tithe. The second tithe is separated after the terum has been given to the priest, and the third tithe has been given to the Levites. Second tithe is to be given during the first, second, fourth, and fifth year of the sabbatical cycle. After the second tithe is separated, it is brought to Jerusalem to be eaten there by its owner. If this is difficult because the journey to Jerusalem is too long, or if the produce became richly impure, it can be redeemed for an equivalent sum of money. If one redeems his own produce, he is required to add 1/5 of his value to the redemption money. The money is then brought to Jerusalem, where it is spent on food. Second tithe can be redeemed only with minted coins. Blank coins or promissory notes cannot be used. Today's second tithe is still redeemed, but only for a nominal sum. Since the absence of the temple, it is no longer brought to Jerusalem. The halachot of second tithe are discussed in Tractate Maaseh Sheni. Because they conducted themselves stringently concerning this matter, and Chaverim, who were meticulous in the observance of the mitzvot, would partake of both offerings of lesser sanctity and second tithe there. The Braita continues, as for the upper pond, whose consecration was incomplete, Amaleorites would enter into there and partake of offerings of lesser sanctity there, and they would not partake of second tithe there. And Chaverim would partake of neither offerings of lesser sanctity nor second tithe there. And for what reason did they not consecrate the upper pond? It was because additions can be made to the city of Jerusalem or to the temple courtyard only by a special body comprising the king, a prophet, their own Tumim, and the Sanhedrin of 71, and with 2 thanks offerings and with a special song. The Gemara asks, but why did they consecrate the upper pond if they could not do so properly? The Gemara responds, why did they consecrate it? Didn't you say that they did not consecrate it? Rather, the question should be asked as follows. Given that they could not consecrate the upper pond, why did they bring it within the walls of the city? The Gemara answers, because it was a weak point, a turpa. What's a turpa? A turpa, weak point. The primary meaning of the word toref is nakedness, which was generalized to refer to any place that should be covered or hidden. Consequently, it is similar in meaning to erva, as in you have come to see the nakedness ervat of the land, Genesis 42:12. In a broad sense, it refers to a place with weak defenses, which can be used as an entry point for enemies. What is described here may refer to the fortifications that were built in the Hasmonean period. In a similar fashion, during the reign of King Agrippa, additional areas on the northern side of Jerusalem, which lacked natural barriers that could serve as obstacles against potential invaders, were included within the third wall of the city. And if you have the Standshell, it says a mosaic of Jerusalem during the Second Temple period with an extension of the third wall shown of Jerusalem, because it would have been easy to conquer the city from there. It became necessary to include it within the wall. This Braita seems to present explicit proof against the opinion of Rabbi Nachman, who holds that there is no need at all for all the procedures listed in the Mishnah in order for the consecration to be complete. The Gemara rejects this proof. There is a dispute between the Tanaim as to whether the initial consecration of Jerusalem and the temple sanctified them only for their time or forever. Abba Shaul maintained that the initial consecration lapsed, and therefore the reconsecration required of all the procedures mentioned in the Mishnah. Where is this dispute taught? It is, as is taught in the Mishnah, Eduyot 8:6, Rabbi Elazar says, I heard that they were building the sanctuary in the second temple. I heard when they were building the sanctuary in the second temple, they fashioned temporary curtains for the sanctuary and temporary curtains for the courtyards. Also for now, Asa Kalaim Lahechel Uklaim La'azoros. Rashi explains that at this point in the discussion of Gemara understands that the purpose of the curtains was to serve as a temporary substitute for the walls of the sanctuary, and the temple courtyard so that the offerings could be sacrificed there, as the initial sanctity of the site of the temple had been nullified, to serve as partitions until the construction of the stone walls was completed. The difference was only that in the sanctuary, the workers built the walls outside the curtains. This is because they tried to prevent people from seeing the inside of the sanctuary. A similar procedure was adopted with respect to the artisans called in to perform repairs in the Holy of Holies. In Tractate Megillah 10a, Rashi explains that a partition was erected to prevent workers from mistakenly entering an area forbidden to them. The curtains without entering, and in the courtyards, the workers built the walls within the curtains. The Mishnah continues. Rabbi Yeshua says, I heard that one sacrifices offerings on the altar even if there is no temple, and one partakes of offerings of a sacred order in the temple courtyard even if there are no curtains, and one partakes of the offerings of lesser sanctity and the second tithe produce in Jerusalem even if there is no wall surrounding the city. This is due to the fact that the initial consecration sanctified the temple and Jerusalem for their time and also sanctified them forever. The Gemara concludes from the fact that Rabbi Yeshua based his opinion on the principle that the initial consecration sanctified the temple and Jerusalem forever. Can one not learn by inference that Rabbi Elazar maintained that it did not sanctify them forever? Apparently, this issue is subject to a dispute between the Tanaim. Ravina said to Rav Ashi, from where do you draw this inference? Perhaps everyone maintained that the initial consecration sanctified the temple and Jerusalem for their time and also sanctified them forever. On one side, Rabbi Elazar stated that tradition which he heard from his teachers, and one side, Rabbi Yeshua stated that tradition from which he heard from his teachers, and there is no dispute between them. And if you would say, why do I need curtains at all according to Rabbi Eliezer? The original sanctuary remained when Jerusalem was not surrounded by walls, and similarly the presence or absence of curtains is irrelevant to the sanctity of the temple area. The Gemara answers that the curtains were established merely for seclusion, as it would have been unbecoming for the activity in this most sacred venue to be visible to all. Rather, this matter is subject to a dispute between these Tanaim, as is taught in a Braita with regard to the walled cities listed in the Mishnah entitled Arichin 32a. Rabbi Shmuel, son of Rabbi Yossi, said, why did the sage enumerate specifically these 9 cities as cities that were walled since the days of Joshua, son of Nun? In fact, there were many more. The reason is that when the exiles ascended to Eretz Yisrael from Babylonia in the time of Ezra, they found these cities and consecrated them. Matzu Elu Kudshum. They found these and consecrated them. When the Jews were exiled after the destruction of the first temple, the sanctity of the cities that were walled in the time of Joshua was nullified. When Ezra ascended at the time of the second entry into Eretz Yisrael, all the walled cities that existed at that time were consecrated as the Jewish people's entry into the land in the days of Ezra compared to their entry in the days of Joshua. Just as when they entered in the days of Joshua, they counted sabbatical and jubilee years, consecrated walled cities, and became obligated in tithes, so too, when they entered in the days of Ezra, they counted sabbatical and jubilee years, consecrated walled cities, and became obligated in tithe. This is because the initial consecration was for the time and not forever. In accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, son of Rabbi Yossi, and from the Rambam Sefer Zerayim, Hilchot Shemitah V'Yovel 12:15, see the Hilchot Teruma 1:5. As walled cities, but the sanctity of the first walled cities enumerated in the book of Joshua was nullified when settlement in Eretz Yisrael was negated and the Jewish people were exiled. The Gemara comments, apparently Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, maintains the initial consecration sanctified the temple in Jerusalem for the time only and did not sanctify them forever. The Gemara raises a contradiction from a different Braita. Rabbi Yishmael, son of Rabbi Yossi, says, were these cities that are enumerated in Tractate Arichin the only walled cities, but then already stated 60 cities, or the region of Argob, the kingdom of Og, king of Bashan, all these were cities fortified with high walls, gates, and bars, Deuteronomy 3:4-5, indicating that there were many walled cities in the time of Joshua. Rather, why did the sage enumerate specifically these cities? It's due to the fact that when the exiles ascended from Babylonian, they found these and consecrated them as walled cities. Gemara asks, they consecrated them. If their sanctity remained, it should not have been necessary to consecrate them. Now, didn't we say later in the same Braita that it is not necessary to consecrate them? The Gemara clarifies rather this is what the Braita means to say. When the exiles ascended from Babylonia, they found these and enumerated them. The Braita continues, and not only these, but in any city with regard to which you receive a tradition from your ancestors, that it was surrounded by a wall from the days of Joshua, son of Nun, all these mitzvot, called mitzvot Elu, special halachot govern the walled cities whose unique sanctity sets them apart from other places in Eretz Yisrael. These include the obligation to send lepers out of the city, the prohibition against turning the outer section of the city into fields, and the halacha with regard to redemption of sole property. With regard to the walled cities that are observed in it, due to the fact that the initial consecration sanctified the temple in Jerusalem for the first time and sanctified them forever. The Gemara comments it's difficult, as there's a contradiction between one statement of Rabbi Yishmael Bar Yossi and another statement of Rabbi Yishmael Bar Yossi. The Gemara answers, if you say that there are 2 Tanaim who disagree with regard to the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael Bar Yossi, each admitted Rabbi Yishmael's opinion in a different manner. And if you were saying instead that one of the traditions is mistaken, and one of the Braitot was stated by Rabbi Elazar Bar Yossi and not his brother Rabbi Yishmael, as it is taught in the Braitot, Rabbi Elazar Bar Yossi says that the verse with regard to the walled city states, which has lower wall, Leviticus 25:30. So what does that mean? Asher lo choma. With regard to the law governing a walled city, the city is defined as walled according to its stated at the time of the conquest of Eretz Yisrael. How so? A city that was not walled at the time of Joshua's conquest, even if it's walled now, is considered an unwalled city. Whereas a city that was walled in the days of Joshua, even if it is not walled now, is considered a walled city. This is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, son of Rabbi Yossi. Now I would ask, if the initial consecration was nullified, why should the critical factor be the city stated at the time of Joshua's conquest? The Kether Mishnah and others understand that the Rambam is describing the consecration of walled cities during the period of the first temple, but that from the time of Ezra, a city is defined as a walled city in accordance with its status in the days of Ezra. Although the Rambam maintained that the initial consecration of Eretz Yisrael was nullified. This halacha does not contradict the ruling of Rabbi Elazar bar Yossi with regard to the issue of walled cities. Rambam Sefer Zerayim Hilchos Shemitah V'Yovel 12:15. The Torah in Leviticus chapter 25 states that an ancestral field cannot be permanently sold. Even if the original owner fails to redeem his land after selling it. No, I'm not up to that one yet. I am. The Torah in Leviticus chapter 25 states that an ancestral field cannot be permanently sold. Even if the original owner fails to redeem his land after selling it, if the field returns to him during the Jubilee year. A different halacha applies to houses in walled cities. One who sells a house in a walled city has a year to redeem it, and if he fails to do so, it becomes the permanent property of the buyer. The owner of the house in a walled city receives fewer protections than the owner of a field, since a house is only a place of residence, while a field is considered a primary source of one's livelihood, said the Ramban. Houses in the walled cities, the walled cities of Levites are governed by the same halacha as ancestral fields. The word lo is written with an aleph, meaning no, and accordingly the verse would be stating to the contrary that the city does not have a wall, but its localization is in the sense of its homonym. Lo with a vav, meaning that it has a wall. This indicates that even if it does not presently have a wall, but it had a wall previously, it retains its status as a walled city. It is Rabbi Elazar bar Yossi who maintained that the first consecration sanctified the temple in Jerusalem forever. Thank you for listening and all the best. Bye.